Très bien. Je pense que nous sommes juste à l'heure ou un petit peu avant, mais on a beaucoup de choses à se dire. Donc bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Hello, everyone. We are delighted to greet you in this room to talk about space. My name is Xavier Pasco. I am the director of the Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris. We are partnering with the foundation that's organizing this great event, and we are delighted to see you here talking about all these topics from your own perspectives. And today we'll be talking about space. You've seen the title, Space, Battlefields, Strategic Challenges and Technological Innovations. If one field has evolved a lot these last few years, I would say it is space. When we started RSMed, space was a topic of a first roundtable 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, that's not such a long time ago, we were assessing all the evolutions. And 4 years now, with everything that's changed since then, seems to be an eternity. Just to give you an idea of how much it's changed, we could give you a few numbers. In 2023, over 2,200 satellites were launched. 2,800 rather. In 2023, that was more than satellites that were launched for a decade between 2008 and 2018. And so when we thought it would be 10, and now it's 100, and when we thought it would be 100, now it's 1,000. Few fields, few domains evolve so fast. 2023 was a record year, and 2024, last year, we had a new record. 2,900 satellites, over which 2,000 were American satellites, over 270 launches, which is even more than at the peak of the Cold War. Let's remember that during the Cold War in the 60s, there were a lot of launches, including by the Soviets. So sometimes they would have 150 launches per year of Soyuz. And now we're above this, and no one would have been able to imagine it. Space has been modeled by the Cold War, by the bipolar confrontation, and we used to think that space had normalized. And for many years, until very recently, we had about 80 to 90 launches per year. That was the global average. And then suddenly, these last few years, it's gone up to 250 per year. Very soon, probably 300 for a year. 15% increase in the number of launches compared to 2023 and 2024. And right now, 55% of these launches are made by the US. Interestingly, China represents 25% of global launches, 6% Russia. Usually we think that for Russia, space is something that comes from their history, but they are still very much represented. And then the rest is represented by 8 countries. So it's quite interesting to keep these numbers in mind because it gives us an idea of how space has evolved. Of course, we can see that there's a strong American domination, but there's also quite a lot of activity from China. Soon, they will represent 60 to 90 launches per year. And when you launch something, that means you have something to launch. So you have to keep that in mind as well. Let's take a step back. For the last few years, generally, globally, spatial activity has intensified in 3 main fields. Firstly, the lower orbit. You've all heard of satellite constellations like the Starlink constellation, which is SpaceX's Elon Musk's constellation. Starlink right now represents about 70 to 75% of all active satellites in orbit. There are about 11,000 satellites, I think, at the moment, 11 to 12,000 active satellites in orbit. I would say there are about over 8,000 of those that belong to Starlink, so Elon Musk's company, SpaceX. So that's the big novelty from these last few years. Second field of activity that has intensified, very unexpected, but the human exploration of space with the comeback of these lunar exploration programs like Apollo, but also in China, not just in the US. In China, there is a comeback of these programs. They want to go back to the moon in the next decades. And third field, the one that's particularly of interest to us here, it's the military field. Things are intensifying there as well in space, and we'll be focusing on that. Other fields of activity have intensified, for example, science and others, but these three domains are captivating states and the private market. These three fields that I've mentioned are at the crossroads of many interests. We are launching into space a lot of material, a lot of objects, a lot of infrastructure. We are almost normalizing it. I like to say that space is becoming normalized because it seems like we're launching almost fiber into the orbit. Logistical infrastructure is interesting for the lower orbit, but also for human exploration, because we don't want to do stop and go anymore. We want to stay there, land on the moon, but also stay there for a while. So we have to do a lot of things in the cislunar space, everything between the Earth and the moon. And it's also of interest to the military, because they want to control operations in space. All of this obviously has impacts on defense and security in space. And has an impact on the spatial environment of nowadays. We're going to delve into these topics with our panelists. Let me introduce them to you briefly. If I can find my notes. I think I've taken the wrong notes, but that's okay. Now I'm sure of it. But what I said to you is completely true, even if I didn't have the right notes in front of my eyes. So first we'll have Guilhem Penent taking the floor from the Ministry for the Army, and he is at the Department for DGRIS and tasked with spatial activities, and he will be talking about these great trends that I have introduced. The Ministry for the Armies in France is very active on the topic and published in 2019 a spatial strategy for defense, and Guilhem will tell us more. And then we have Colonel Fabrice Castrigno among us. He is the director of the Strategic Command for Space, and he will tell us what space is in the perspective of the Army. And we'll talk about the intensification of space. In the next few weeks, there will be a symbolic act that will represent the increase of these activities, and he will tell us about it. And then we'll see what happens for those who make those spatial systems. All these trends that I've talked about, they have consequences on states, of course, but also on industrial actors. In the last 4 years, since our first roundtable, a lot has happened in the industrial space with a lot of difficulties that have arisen for the European industrial sector, French industrial sector with Airbus. Maybe you've followed this situation with Thales. They're wondering about the structure of their activities and the impact it could have on their production. So it would be interesting to see how these transformations, when Europe is a pioneer of spatial activities, it would be interesting to see how we can deal with this new landscape. So Hugo Richard from ArianeGroup will be among us. He is the director of the CEO. He's chief of staff for the CEO. And then we'll have Christophe Debar from Thales, and he is tasked with the coordination of activities in the security and military space field. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Guilhem. Guilhem, could you please tell us about this evolution and the current landscape in space? So I encourage you to use the Slido system to ask your questions. You already know of this system. Do not hesitate to ask any question you have through this platform, and then we will be able to display them on screen and answer them according to the order of priority you've given to those questions. So, Guilhem, thank you, Xavier. Thank you also to the organizers for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be a part of this roundtable, which, from what I've understood, means also space is back on the RSMed's agenda. So I'm particularly happy about that. Just as probably all of you, I've been really interested in all the topics that have been raised these last few days, with a lot of common threads from one roundtable to another. For example, the Russian threat, the resort to strength, the decrease of solidarity, technological challenges. We've also talked a lot about the enlargement of conflict spaces, including in space, which will be of interest to us today. So globally, it feels like we are agreeing that there's a return of war, of strategic competition. Ambassador Vimont also talked about the complexity of the situation. I think we can agree on that. What I want to say here, and Xavier, you've talked about normalization. It is true, we have a normalization of space that is at stake. And that is quite an obvious thing, because space, for at least the Ministry for Armies, space is geo-centered. Space, of course, is impacted by evolutions on land and sometimes amplifies them. So there's almost, it's like a mirror, or sometimes space acts as a magnifying glass of what is happening on land. So I will try and describe from my own perspective what the main strategic challenges are. I think there are 4 elements on which we should be delving. First issue, when we talk about strategic challenges in space, I think we should think of this imbalance between actors at play, this difference in capabilities between entities, which means there's an asymmetry and dependence and vulnerability as well. Xavier, you talked about the time of the Cold War, and I also think that was one of the massive transformations that happened during the Cold War. There was a use of space that was shared between 2 major players, the US and Russia, or the USSR, but nowadays this is very different. We have one major player far ahead, the US, and other players. That means space is being used in on different levels. So depending on the level of dependence, but also the level of resilience associated with uses of space. And so there's a major difference now between the entities or players that are well ahead and can use space more efficiently as a force multiplier, and nations that are in the lower ranks. There's a difference also between nations that have military access to space without restrictions, or almost without restrictions, and those that, in order to use space, depend on a third party. This goes to explain as well why we have a variety of actors coming up with various strategies. And I think we should talk about the first strategy, the strategy of circumventing when there is a major player, and that's related to the major transformation that happened during the Cold War. I think there is no more restraint when it comes to using space militarily anymore. During the Cold War, there were a series of tacit, implicit norms, standards, and restraint there were certain authorized uses of space, or at least implicit agreements on how to use space, and we can see now that the situation is changing and that restraint is gone. And I have a few examples in mind. These last few years, it means that we've seen irresponsible behaviors or unfriendly behavior, hostile behaviors, multiplying, intensifying. I'm trying to find a synonym for these behaviors, but it is because it is difficult to qualify them for two main reasons, and they have to do with the nature of space itself. Vast and hostile by nature, it is difficult to understand what is happening in space. For those of us that are impacted by these events, we are confronted with a dilemma. When an event happens, we have to distinguish accidents from intentional acts. And even when we understand the intention behind it, we do not always manage to get back to the or get to the origin of that act and get to the actor that caused that event. Second dilemma, that of the response we need to bring. And that's exactly what I was saying. It is difficult to legally and politically qualify these events and to associate them with a response that would be both credible but also proportionate. This is a very difficult area to apprehend, to understand, to deal with, which is why it leads to intimidation strategies, destabilization strategies. Many modes of action have been made accessible and have been developed by various actors, Russia and China mostly, alongside the counter-space continuum. So we have a variety of effects that can be associated with these actions. They can be reversible effects, for example, jamming, or temporary glare or dazzle. And it can also be something much more extreme, leading to permanent and indiscriminate effects. For example, the anti-satellite test that was experimented in November 2021 by Russia that aimed at destroying a Russian satellite and creating a debris cloud in an orbit that was very much frequented is an example of it. Another main strategy that we've seen appear these last few years, and it's not contradictory, it's not so much the circumventing strategy or the denial of access, but it's rather a strategy of emulating. So space, which used to be the monopoly of Western players, mostly in the US above all, is now shared among more entities. As an example, some of you might remember an article that's quite a founding article on this. Barry Posen, at the end of the 90s, was talking about space as being a structural pillar of the United States. And he also wrote that that power was being confronted with a strategy of denial of access, which has been confirmed since. What he hadn't talked so much about back then was that in reality the use of space for military and operational purposes was being shared increasingly. Xavier, you've mentioned it in your introduction. It is true, increasingly more and more actors are interested in the militarization of space, and they are trying to reinforce this integration of space into their operations. It is particularly obvious and spectacular in China. China right now is almost on par or even ahead of the US when it comes to certain fields. For example, the observation of Earth and maritime observation. They're also making a lot of effort on connectivity. This is an effort that hasn't materialized completely yet, but it will be materialized by the end of this decade. So there's a Starlink equivalent in China that's being developed. On the Russian side, that's also an important effort that they're making, and is also being made in the context of the war in Ukraine. In parallel to that desire to integrate space into armed forces, we see a new architecture being developed, and we've talked about it a lot during previous roundtables. So I'm talking about the development of constellations, but also more prospective, forward-looking topics that are very real. The active launches. So we can see that their actors are highlighting resilience, how to counter threats, but also the need to be more reactive and efficient. And there again, these efforts will create a new military and space hierarchy in the near term. Fourth element, I was talking about the multilateral frameworks and how contested they are. Maybe you have it in mind. The legal framework for space is mostly about the Treaty on Space from 1967. That space treaty is mostly trying to uphold principles like the freedom of use and Pacific peaceful uses of space and non-appropriation of space. And these principles that are still valid lead to varied interpretations nowadays when it comes to implementing them. Some actors also try to circumvent these principles or to instrumentalize them. You might have heard of some intelligence shared by the US last year when it came to the nuclearization of space by Russia, which is actually forbidden in this treaty. So again, there's been quite a lot of changes since the Cold War on this front. Other element, that of the distrust between players. They sometimes understand the negative effects of some behaviors, for example, when they create debris in space. And under some circumstances, they think of the necessity for collective security because they are interdependent.
Et bien néanmoins, ces acteurs aussi.
And these actors do not hesitate to instrumentalize frameworks or to disinform and manipulate those elements. And very concretely, this means there is a narrative battle. Main players are accusing each other. The US is divulging, for example, information and is accusing Russia, and Russia always reacts to that as well. And this also means there's a clear power play on standards and norms. For the major players, the idea is to be the ones defining the rules. I will let the Colonel talk about this, but what response should we offer for these challenges? Well, this is precisely the work we did 6 years ago through the Strategy for Defense in Space, published in 2019. In spite of this dependence and vulnerability, the goal is not to renounce space. That would be a gift to our competitors. And that would be doing exactly what our competitors want us to do. So the idea is to keep occupying space, investing in space in order to strengthen our ability to understand and make decisions. But it's also about accompanying this effort with a discouraging effort. That's what I call the discouraging posture. I mentioned that this threat was multidimensional, and this discouragement posture has to also be multidimensional and global. During the various roundtables, we said we had several levers that we could use. The idea here is to synchronize all these levers. That's precisely what we're trying to do at the Ministry for the Armed Forces by using what we called active defense, meaning we have to show that we are able to see what's happening from space, and we show that we are able to act in a proportionate way. Maybe you remember back in 2018, the minister, Florence Parly, had denounced an action by a Russian satellite near a French satellite, and had publicly denounced that type of sabotage activity. So again, that's the discouragement posture I was talking about. However, that effort is necessary but insufficient, and it has to be propped up by other elements like resilience. There again, it's about discouraging the adversary. It's about showing that the action they're trying to implement through a destabilization act will not be successful, so we can use several levers. We can, for example, strengthen our resilience through constellations, through cooperation with NATO, for example, and Article 7. At NATO, a strong message was sent when it came to its applicability in space. A few years ago, a similar effort is being made at the EU, and a lot of work is being done on interoperability with the major players and through NATO as well. And since we are in a mixed format among panelists, it's also about making an effort with our trusted partners like industrial actors. In our space defense strategy in 2019, we've highlighted the importance of transparency. It's about showing that we're very clear. We have very clear intentions. And in order to show that we are legitimate, this effort is also accompanied with so I talked about the difficulty of having good faith conversations in these platforms, but it's about being proactive and making proposals, as our diplomat colleague said. It's about trying to stabilize the space environment and thinking of the effort we're making with our partners. For example, we're making a lot of effort on responsible behavior standards. It's about trying to control the unintended consequences of any escalation in space. It's about reducing miscalculation risks. The best example I can quote is the commitment we took, the French, with our partners. We decided not to respond to the test that was experimented by Russia in 2021, where they destroyed a satellite and created this cloud of debris that I mentioned earlier. So that was just a few elements about the responses we're thinking of from our side, but I think Colonel Castrigno can tell you more. Thank you, Guilhem, for this first response, and thank you for telling us about the space landscape and how it's been accelerated these last few years. And we'll now delve into the military aspect of these changes. Colonel Castrigno, please go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Pasco. Thank you to everyone. The title is Space Battlefield. Nowadays, it has been made clear that space is a battlefield. It is about strategic competition, and it involves military aspects, but also civilian activity. Space nowadays is a place that we could consider a superiority field for operational activity for armed forces, but it's also a place that's essential for our societies. Let's take all the major changes that have happened in space these last few years. As Guilhem said, France has published a space strategy for defense, the first one in Europe. And the strategic challenges that we have to deal with within the Ministry of Armed Forces are challenges that have been described in this space defense strategy. First, in this strategy, they had acknowledged the increasing number of activity in space, but also the increasing number of conflicts in space, which has been greatly increasing these last few years. Between 2019 and 2025, 6 years have passed, and these dynamics have not slowed down, quite the opposite. So they have been intensified. We're talking about those two major trends. First, the adaptation of defense capabilities. We have to do that to take into account these changes, and we have to keep in mind our two goals to support inter-army operations, so support armed forces and in their operations. And second goal is to protect our spatial and space interests. So I'm talking about military interests, but also civilian interests.
And of course, technical innovations are fully part of these objectives. Not referring again to the notion that there's a boom in space activities, but I would like now to focus on duality. At present, we have a capacity to use civil and commercial services for defense, and this is one of the great changes that we're witnessing, and the conflict in Ukraine really illustrates this, and way beyond Starlink that has directly supported the Ukrainian army. But there's a number of offers, the service offers that are provided to the Ukrainian army, and that is used to lead operations, including to identify targets. The second aspect is that of conflictuality and the polarization of international tensions, including in space. Quite clearly, the space is no longer a permissive space. It is an area of conflict, and this appears very clearly in the 2025 international strategic review. There's a major risk of high-intensity conflict at the horizon of 2030, and space infrastructures will probably be the first that will be targeted. The ARNS also mentions a confrontational approach by our competitors, and that implies the deployment of anti-satellite capacities, as Guilhem said, and the entire value chain in space up until orbital satellites. There again, the conflict in Ukraine sheds light onto this wide range conflict, and we are witnessing widening of the threat, and we believe that airspace will be directly involved in the framework of a high-intensity conflict, and this is exacerbated by the gray area that airspace is as of today, and the strong duality that makes it possible to hide military activity behind civilian uses. So there's a hybrid characteristic, and our competitors are taking advantage of this. So as we analyze modern conflictuality, this analysis between conflictuality and development really applies to airspace. This being said, I'd like to come back to the strategic dimension, and ASSD is is actually determining an ambitious and clear roadmap that has a dual target. First of all, maintaining national strategy and being able to autonomously appreciate the situation in terms of intelligence, but also how we lead operations and defend our interests. What's at stake for French armies is to be able to distinguish, to have resilient and reactive space capacities as well as operational capacities, including in the framework of a high-intensity conflict. And this is what we have to get ready for. To that aim, the ASSD recommends us to review our industrial models and making them more agile, accelerating acquisitions, turning towards on-shelf solutions that can be used immediately and take advantage of technological innovations. And this is clearly the added value that will help us further developing our capacities and becoming more reactive. 5 years after ASSD, things have become clearer, things have been developed operationally and in terms of governance as well, with the creation of the space division within the army, and we have a different way to implement our capacities in space. We have launched many innovative projects together with the LD and the DGA. We are systematically taking into account commercial services so as to develop our space capacities. This is all nice and well, but now, in the face of increasing threats, we have to accelerate, and SSD has to accelerate. We have to better innovate, to innovate faster in the 3 key areas: seeing and understanding, acting. When we talk about seeing and understanding, this is the capacity to detect space objects, whether they be military or whether they be a risk factor, like debris, so as to have the most updated, most precise capacity. Secondly, detecting is nice, but we need to be able to evaluate the situation, characterize objects, classify intentions, and this is the Space Domain Awareness, the SDA, which adds up an operational capacity. The Ministry of Armies is pursuing the diversification of its information sources, whether information comes from radars, telescopes, space SSA, and commercial service, foreign partners, so as to enrich and further develop our capacity. Third key area, action. And in the entire value chain, we must cover the origin and the destination. We owe our army to have space capacities that be resilient and reactive. Resilient because our space capacity at present is quite limited in numbers. And when you have with Starlink almost 6,000 satellites, if you lose 150, it's not such a big deal. You can keep waging war. But now if we lose a satellite, we are much less resilient. So we have to change the infrastructure that we have. We have to rethink our infrastructure so as to be more distributive, differentiate capacities, and rethink the relation between partnerships, trade partnerships, and what we already have within 2019 SSD, we had a resilience that was defined in 3 circles. Central area, our actions and that of our friend partners, and the commercial services. Now, with the polarization in international relations and major changes in historical alliances, including with our American partner, this view is somewhat outdated, and we must make sure that our own legacy is more resilient. So we have to acquire massive means. We have to purchase more equipment so as to to be hands-on whenever we need to. ANRS 2025 clearly states that we have to develop capacities to forbid, deny, or alter our adversaries' space capacities, whether it be in space with patrol programs that you've heard of, or by implementing our capacity for action towards space. But of course we must act in a gradual way, in a diversified way, and whilst abiding by the international law. Very concretely, what are the innovations that we can offer? We want to set up a structure that can help reducing the difference between information gathering and information use. So we have to accelerate the decision loop using the pivot of lower orbits and changing the way we implement space observation, and we must reduce the latency between the record of data and the use of data. We need to further develop a network and a mesh between our services in satellites or on Earth. We have to rethink the distribution, the capacity, and the resilience. We must use AI embarked on satellites so as to handle information on board and accelerate the loop by transmitting the information directly to the soldier on the field and just the information that's needed at a given time. Fourth aspect of technology that we focus on, we need to decentralize our calculation capacity using a cloud system so as to use in real time the information collected by satellites. We must also bet on future technologies, quantics and nuclear uses as a source of energy and propulsion, and this will be interesting for our patrolling satellites. If we use if you use nuclear power, we could get rid of the Kepler law and spatial mechanics laws, and it will allow us to be less predictable. As a conclusion, I'd say that to have an operational superiority, we must have a technological superiority. All the more in this context of intensification in space use for the military. We must base ourselves on innovation so as to adapt our space capacities and adapt them to our national objectives. We have a very smooth relation with our industrial partners. There is the space circle of confidence. It's been created in January 2025 under the leadership of the Space General Authority. It brings together actors from the military and companies, so as to better understand needs and adapt the capacities to those needs. We have the city based in Toulouse. It must be integrated within the space ecosystem and maintain tight relations with the industrial world. As General Burkhardt said, the objective is to go fast, be efficient, with one objective in mind for us: the success of French armies, because now more than ever we need to work relentlessly, because perhaps war will not be won in space but could be lost in space. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for explaining this regarding the circle of confidence, the cercle de confiance that was created recently, and that's a great transition with our two next panelists. It seems like that the human dimension is ever more important. The more technology you have, the more human actions you need. So you need to understand all of this, and you need to keep to be at the forefront. The worst would be a divergence and a siloed approach. So this cohesion is very central, and thank you for explaining this. Now I'm giving the floor to Hugo Richard, representing ArianeGroup. ArianeGroup means that France is independent in its access to space, and if you don't have no access to space, you cannot be independent. So that's one important thing. And you said that we have new missions and targets now. It means a lot of energy, a lot of technology, and a lot of experience. So we're turning towards you, Hugo. Thank you, Xavier. Good afternoon. Yes, indeed. Space is the new front line, and we've got to be there. Our freedom to access space is at stake. So we need a launcher, a heavy one, and the figures that you gave were quite telling. And they illustrated the position of Europe. It doesn't appear to be ideal. We wanted the Europeans to be back on the scenes with Ariane 6. We kept waiting. We were very patient. And by the way, I must thank the armies. And this translated into the best possible way with the launch of CSO on board Ariane 6 last spring. Ariane 6 is a development that took longer than expected, some 10 years or so, and CSO was the first load. And the French armies trusted this program, and they were quite ready to do so. The last load that had been launched by Ariane 5 was also a military load. It was Syracuse. And this shows that there is no more civilian space. Even if you use a civil launcher, space has become a military area. Now, if you want to use space, you need a launcher, you need a base, and you need a surveillance network. And this is a new front line. And I was asking myself, what was new on that front line? It may sound old-fashioned, but from the side of industrialists and manufacturers, we need to watch towards the space. This is something we became aware of more than 4 years ago, actually. That was back in 2008 that we asked ourselves the question if we as operators should turn towards space. And that was after an anti-satellite shooting was done by the American, and ATV was involved. So on the basis of the information that we had, mainly American information, we shot, and it went well, but we realized after a while that shots from the American state had been stopped for 3 weeks. So we had to become aware of the situation. Guilhem, you mentioned the strategic confrontation. You mentioned strategists, diplomats. At the same time, we came to realize that it would be a good idea to have a grave-type radar so as to could be part of a more active dialogue, so as to use our strategic capacities and differentiate ourselves from the public American catalogs. We wanted to remain a major actor. Regarding ops in ArianeGroup, we starting turning towards space, and in 2012 we were faced to one of the first event of that kind when Syracuse was visited by a satellite, and that it was classified information, but we came to realize that things were going on. Now it's a good thing to keep history in mind, and very obviously in the context of war in Ukraine, we see how dependent we are. We really depend on space infrastructures on a daily basis. Space is becoming a front line, and the two major changes that I see today are that, first of all, there's an acceleration. So it's a playground where you've got to act faster, and you must be able to play with several gears and speeds. You've got to be able to master trajectories, and secondly, this playground is getting bigger on all directions. So we have to integrate those two drivers, the time factor and the enlargement of the playground. So our engineers and technicians must keep up with the new situation. A key message is that military needs are significant, and we have to integrate time factor within our surveillance systems. We have to better master trajectories. We see them in space, but we've got to be able to see them in real time now, so as to prevent risks. We must develop our anti-collision capacities. In the light of debris, we've got to better target, better identify, and better anticipate. And we must be able to prevent threats. These threats are our daily threats. The British Space Commander mentioned all the daily threats that British satellites face on a daily basis. So we are not turning a blind eye on this reality. Our job is to better define space surveillance as the basis for our operations. We've got to be able to see and see faster. And as you said, Guilhem, we've got to support you in gaining more capacity. This is nothing new, but we're witnessing events, orbital events that are quite spectacular. Co-orbital operations whereby we see a satellite giving birth, so to speak, to another satellite. So if you're not able to see it in full daylight, you have 2542 Cosmos. Back in 2020, we had the Russian satellite giving birth to a Cosmos 2543. So we have to have the capacity at any given time to identify these satellites and track them permanently in any observation circumstances. So this must be a daily work and daily expectation. On the Ukrainian front, we also have space operations involving Chinese satellites. SG-21 and 25 carry out orbital operations that are quite interesting because you can see robot arms, and we get trained in installing a satellite that reaches the end of its life in a specific place on the orbit. Now we have to develop this capacity to see in real time, and this means we have to manage databases. That's one thing, but we must also be able to watch one spot with well-defined references, identify the trajectory, being able to describe and characterize that platform and its technical characteristics so as to deduct its function. And we need to use ops to be able to identify their intention. So it's not about managing data, but more and more it's about providing a full-fledged space service. It's not about managing raw data. It's about delivering an entire service based on reliable data. We must have the capacity to produce our own data and make sure the data is reliable and integrates missing data that complement public American data. How can we better master this time factor and act in a sustainable way? On the basis of the network that we've been developing over the last 10 years, that ArianeGroup and Space Domain Awareness, this Helix network covers about 50 sensors throughout the world. We have optical technology, and we make sure we have wide scopes and tracking capacities. On that basis, we put together all the information in our headquarters in the Muro near Paris, where we develop the interfaces with our clients and including with us, the Space Command Division. This is an important message. We take risks and we invest. We use our own capital. And this is something quite important. We must make the right choices, right technological choices. We use optical technology whilst ensuring the performance of the entire system in time. So we have to make the appropriate technological choices so as to sustain our actions. We must be able to target items with our telescopes day or night. So we must master infrared technologies. In order to do so, we've got to gain in precision. Our engineers have this expertise to develop laser tracking. And in the framework of consortiums with other actors, we are developing the capacity to pilot, to use that type of data, whilst refreshing them in the most efficient way. With such a system, we have the capacity to precisely meet the needs of institutions, CNES, the European Commission, through EU SST, which is the body that manages anything related to anti-collision and debris management. This will be further reinforced. It's part of the legislative projects that are on the table in Brussels. We have the capacity to better securize launches for Ariane in the framework of space operations law under the auspices of the CNES, and with networks such as Helix, we are able to precisely organize launching operations, and this brings more resilience in our operations. We are able to better manage our launches, but also evaluate our competitors' launches. And we are able to determine the nationality, the origin of a platform, which would not necessarily be fully identified to begin with. So we can identify the primary service. We have the capacity to determine the intention of our competitors, and we can identify ever more difficult objects to identify.
This brings me to my second point, the mastery of the spatial territory, which is constantly enlarged towards the superior parts. Maybe we'll be talking about cislunar space, orbits, and lunar exploration, and maybe even the nuclear capabilities in space. But I will focus on very low orbits for the moment. The continuum that we are talking about here at RSMed between very high altitude and low orbits. That was the topic of the previous roundtable. During the previous roundtable, we also mentioned the new conventional ballistic missiles, and those objects that are within a gray zone that's difficult to defend and difficult to observe between the 30 and 100 kilometers of altitude. So there is a strategic continuum in space that needs to be better mastered, better observed, better analyzed, and it requires a lot of investments. Once we've said that, we haven't said much when it comes to the technological and industrial standpoint. There is a strategic continuum, Yes, but there is no physical continuum. Each one of these fields has its own specificities, and that touches to the heart of our work at ArianeGroup. We have to be capable of transitioning from the airspace to the exo-atmospheric space, and that is precisely what we do at ArianeGroup. We have to launch our ballistic missiles and Ariane launchers. They have to go from the lower layers to the upper layers and enter the atmosphere with objects being carried by ballistic missiles. So there are a lot of capacities in terms of propulsion, in terms of operation, remote operation, and these capabilities must be at the heart of our work at the moment. I think I need to speed up, so I'll try and wrap up and say how we can respond to this second challenge. First, by trying to target the right demonstrators to validate the right strategic choices. In a civilian space, we talk a lot about the reuse. In the commercial space at ArianeGroup, we've come up with the next engine, which will be propulsing the next launchers, Prometheus. But then what we need to do next is to test during flights all these new technologies and gain maturity, and that can only be done by testing physically. And then the atmospheric re-entry, I've mentioned it briefly. We've demonstrated the VMAX demonstrator. We've tested the first glider demonstrators as well in Europe, and that's how we can learn lessons from live demonstrations. And then we test directly with operational actors. Colonel, you were talking about the circle of confidence. Based on your operational needs, we need to better master the effects of your operations, and we also need to be by your side, very closely work with you. So industrial actors and operational actors have to work very closely, just as we do for deterrence. We need to be able to test new methods and new objects. For example, we've already done one demonstration. Alexis mentioned it this morning in 2022. We've done it very quickly. We were able to control the Helios satellites that were re-entering the atmosphere to try and test the effects of atmospheric jamming. And that's a kind of experiment that we want to be able to replicate hand in hand with operational actors to see if it satisfies their needs. I am wrapping up, and I will give you the floor in a second, Christophe. We've talked about how we need to better understand the situation to help operational actors. We've also seen the industrial development picking up speed, and I want to say that we need to be capable of transforming ourselves as well. We need to be able to wrap up these experiments, and I think the difficult step after that will be to scale up. We've done a lot in terms of open innovation with programs 2030 in France. How do we now industrialize some of these capabilities with small and big actors? That will be the issue we need to work on, because they will need to be deployed in the next few years for defense purposes. Thank you for this very complete outlook. Christophe? I think you'll be controlling my timing quite tightly, so I might forget to respond to what you were saying. When you mentioned 2012, I was the director of the Syracuse program. I'll not delve into this, but it was a very interesting start. Firstly, when I read the question that was asked our roundtable, I was wondering why we didn't add more actors, because in 2012 In NATO, the question was space, it's an operational ground and not necessarily a battlefield. Space is a field, indeed, and as Colonel said, it is diffusing everywhere and it is geocentered. It is always from and to space, so I think this logic of confrontation, we've all said it, has nothing new in space. It's always been a strategic, technical, economic confrontation. Back in the day, it was Thales making Syracuse or Citral for French and Italian states in a confrontational logic against the Russians, and we follow NATO standards. And the Russians didn't lose their know-how in a way. They've even amplified it. In a similar way, watching Earth, observing Earth, having high precision was essential. I have to bring my mic closer to my mouth. So what has changed globally since that period of time? Why are we again asking ourselves whether space is a battlefield? Firstly, technology has become more and more accessible. So those new tools that are more accessible have amplified the number of actors with a startup effect that we've seen in all economic fields. And I do not like to talk about militarization of space because up until now I haven't seen, for example, a plane carrier in space, but what is true is that it's been democratized. So space has become more accessible, which means there are more actors in space and we need to watch them more, but it also means there are more opportunities. Secondly, there's an enlargement of the space field. It used to be about communication, but now space surveillance and spatial action have increased. So we have in-orbit servicing, SSA, zone surveillance, and video navigation that has increased as well. Thirdly, strategic evolution, geostrategic evolution. When I started my career, there was a crisis that was covering half the Earth, and now it's covering the entire globe with various needs all over the place. Obviously, we will do all we can to protect Europe, and we have our partners to count on. So what are the challenges that we need to take up? First challenge on which we work on quite a lot at Thales. So I'll pick up on the three elements you mentioned, low orbit, exploration, and military field. Firstly, we have to integrate the low orbit into military capabilities. So this is all about making things hybrid. We talk about this word a lot. And that means we have on the one hand to keep our assets and what we've done, but also complement it. So for that, we have to maintain high performance, because when there will be a high-intensity war, Russians will use the methods that they knew how to use 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But we also have to facilitate access to constellations. So constellations in Europe are precisely about this. So for example, at Thales, when we think of this issue, we think of it under a government perspective. These constellations have to be secured, but they also have to give access to all of Europe to communication at a reasonable cost. Once we have deployed this system, I'm not saying the Russians are not going to be able to do exactly what they always were able to do, and they can do a lot in low orbit, and they've demonstrated it. They've exploded a satellite, and then it creates enough debris to annoy everyone else. They've done it once. Can they do it again? That's a different question, but they've demonstrated that they could do it once. And then there are some older threats that could be debilitating, and usually we respond to these threats. Second example, when it comes to intelligence services, we'll always need to know what's happening in different places. We'll always need to have, for example, Helios and Iris at the moment. But we also need to be able to have revisit because there is transparency. So in this field, I've said there are so many actors working on so many topics in space. For example, what we used to do on the très haut de spectrum, we've simplified it, and now we have a revisit system, a revisit instrument. We've self-financed it, and we've sold it to a certain number of startups, including American startups. You can see it on our website. So we make instruments for Black Sky, for example, and it has very impressive results. So that's the first challenge. How do we manage to get the symbiosis, complementarity between the O2 spectrum and the access to constellations? When it comes to constellations, Europe will be an indispensable partner because satellites in itself are cheaper. The number of satellites, though, in a constellation means it's a little more expensive. Mr. Musk knows these prices, but we also have some experience in this. Second issue. So I was trying to relate the high orbit and the multi-layer, the multi-orbit on which we need to be able to simplify the work of those on Earth. Second element that you mentioned was that of exploration. The first level of exploration is about mastering space. In the framework of mastering space, when we talk about mastering space, I think there are three ways to do it. Firstly, find alternatives if something wrong happens in space, whether it's multi-layer or multi-orbit. But that's also when the question of high altitude will be raised. So for us, it's a big balloon that doesn't move too much and resists to high winds and allows us to place radars or optical tools from Thales, helping us surveil an entire area. We've launched several objects, just as this balloon, and it does reach those infrastructures quite fast. Second element, resilience. When it comes to resilience, it's all about protecting and surveilling from space, but also surveilling space from the ground. And that is a huge element among current challenges. There's the replacement of Grave radar, a project called Aurore, which is struggling to get started, but we're hoping it picks up speed soon. The idea is to, in addition to everything that's already existing and all the elements we already have for observation, to get more data. Thirdly, third element, action. When it comes to acting, we're working on it with the Commission on a project called EROS in a European setting where we coordinate. Thales is coordinating the European project with EROS. It's for example, it has a moving arm. Everyone knows what a big plane looks like with a stick and another plane refueling it. We have to do the same thing in space, and the situation is slightly different. The temperatures are not the same. The atmosphere isn't the same. So those questions are being raised. And the question of anti-satellite weapons, we're also working on that. Are we working on it for destructive purposes or debilitating purposes? Destructive, for example, as the Russians are doing and the Chinese, that could debilitate everyone. It could deter everyone, deter the Russians and the Chinese. You do not want to hit an opponent's satellite because you risk impacting yourself as well. This is not quite a human-friendly environment. So, another challenge is mastering space. So, firstly, alternative, resilience with Grave, or acting in space. Third challenge, I would say it's less technological than the first two. It's about trying not to get disrupted. Everyone has been admitting to the importance of this challenge for years, but you also have to avoid spreading out your resources too much. If you spread out too much, you might not get any results. So we have to focus on a few priorities. Innovation is happening really fast, and in a way it's generating a cost for all entities, quite a high cost. It's the case for already worked on fields, but also fields that we are only starting to work on. So when you do a SATCOM, an observation, and SSA, you have to be able to generate for all of these elements. And secondly, there is a need to anticipate. I could mention as an example IRIS², which is a European constellation. We've received this contract. This is great. The project is about to get started, but when it comes to IRIS², we've realized that in Europe we do not possess some electronic elements, which means we are dependent on actors outside of Europe because we did not anticipate well enough that we wanted to implement IRIS². So we're learning from our mistakes, but it's important to anticipate. So for me, this multi-layer effect of hybrid action is important, and give our forces this multi-orbit access is very important, and we have to also think of the reuse and reactivity. Another issue is that of the mastery of space, and last issue that we have to think of, we have to be capable in the end, so let's avoid spreading ourselves out too much. Innovation, we have to keep innovating. We'll keep on having our space business catalyst at Thales with lots of startups. We'll keep on preparing for the future, as you've mentioned, with quantum computers. There's a space cloud as well coming up, and I'm probably forgetting about a few others. So all of these elements, we have to prepare for them. I do not know when quantum technology will appear, but if we do not anticipate, it's other partners that will need to be trusted if they are our partners. So once we innovate, we have to integrate innovation, and this is all about scaling up, as you've mentioned. So partnerships within the supply chain will be essential for that. Thales is really happy to have signed a partnership with another actor, and we offer a system of satellite control to a certain number of startups, the same that we use for Syracuse, for example. So it's very important to keep in mind this logic of integration of the supply chain. Third point, it's important to coordinate technologies and technological development, because for each of these elements, we won't be able to create a new technology for each one of these elements. It is not sustainable. As I was saying, we went from high precision observation to revisit observation through declension, and we are currently coming up with IRIS². The Commission started the program. There will be useful or payload systems that will be created in low orbit. We need to have in the geosphere the same technologies and same standards. In the same way, the 5G, so a lot of people ask us, what will the 5G bring to operational actors? 5G will, I'm pretty sure you all have it in your pocket, this thing. We're all very happy that it is 5G or 4G at least, just because it means we're able to communicate. 5G in space is pretty much about the same thing. For the moment, we have models on different systems, and we'll need to standardize them. First, it will help us to respond to collective challenges, but also have this interoperational and interoperability between all these systems. So I think innovating is important, integrating is important, and last point, and then I will give the mic back to you because I could feel it is urgent. I think the important thing, and Hugo, you were mentioning it, we've done a lot of research and development, a lot of innovation. We've done a lot of experiments and testing. We are currently launching projects, large-scale projects. When I talked about hybrid action and orbit, the idea is to integrate ground, Earth orbit, and air orbit in one project, so that, as I was saying earlier, I shouldn't be wondering where the satellites are. This is a huge issue, so we'll need to keep launching projects. And there are many projects currently implemented, IRIS, for example, on the military side. With our partners in Europe, the same thing. So we'll have to add all of this in a timeline so that we are able to turn to partners, for example, China and the US, if we do not anticipate well enough. So I think what we need to do is to try and avoid finding ourselves lacking technology. We have to keep having access to these technologies. We have to avoid being without the O2 spectrum systems. And then we have to maintain this complementarity between all the layers so that in the end we are able to make sure the European populations can prosper, but also we're able to defend ourselves. Thank you very much, Christophe. Thank you. That was very thorough. Thank you for all of your comments. This is a complete landscape of all the challenges, security, military, technological challenges in space, and you've made it understandable because we're talking about a lot of different systems. We're talking about AI, edge computing, quantum computing, but it is difficult to convey this meaning. So thank you. We haven't talked about cyber at all. However, we know that nowadays some of the main threats in space that we're talking about are cyber threats. In the background, we also have this golden doe situation. Alexis mentioned it this morning because all these systems, we know they're completely changing at the moment, and it's all about architecture and infrastructure. Christophe, I think you're exemplifying, showing very clearly that all the elements have to be articulated together. We are running out of time. A few questions were asked. Let's try and answer some of them. We have a few minutes. The first question, which is the most popular, is the following. In case of a high-intensity war, should we get ready to lose communication satellites and GPS? So I guess the question is, will the priority targets be the communication satellites and GPS, or is the question rather, should we get prepared to lose them in case of a high-intensity war? I do not want to preempt your answers, but yes, we do have the sentiment that networks, since they're bigger and bigger, are targeted increasingly as well. Very briefly, the answer is yes, we should get ready to lose these capabilities. Luckily, some things have been made redundant. For example, GPS, let's think of Galileo. The impact on daily lives will be huge because GPS is about positioning, navigation, but also time. And time is huge because it also regulates all of international financial transactions. So we could very easily imagine that we're losing the exact timing, and that would have huge economic effects. In that case, we are keeping this issue, this threat in mind, and that might be one of the first target for Russians, for example. Would you like to add something? Yes, just to add to what was said, we are getting ready with exercises and scenarios. The goal is not only to prepare the Ministry of Armed Forces, but we've tried to do it as well with other groups. For example, other ministries and all public administrations. Typically, these are scenarios for which we're getting ready. We're trying to simulate them thanks to the GDSN and to raise awareness on the level of threats so that people understand their level of dependence better. The reality is we struggle to understand our level of dependence on space. Space is vast. How dependent are we on space? How many threats can emanate from space? Those are things we're getting prepared to understand better. Second question, what type of threat, jamming, anti-satellite weapons, spatial debris are the most worrying for orbit infrastructures? Christophe, I think you were talking about destructive actions and debilitating actions. So it feels like when you make debris in space, you incapacitate everyone, including yourself. Jamming now is something that's quite frequent, right? Yes, that's frequent every day in Ukraine. A big part of Central Europe in the north is impacted by GPS jamming. And it is a poor man's weapon because GPS is very easy to jam. The example of jamming is quite typical. There's on-ground jamming, but also jamming of satellites themselves. A lot of work is being done. This is a multi-layer work that helps us obtain on some systems. For example, Galileo. Galileo has been made with a civilian infrastructure, a governmental and civilian infrastructure as well, so we won't lose it with just a single jamming. And then aside from that, there's a strategic entity. In Ukraine, it's high intensity, so we're working on several layers. There's Galileo, and then the Commission is also working on it. One last question before we wrap up. In a space where legislation isn't respected anymore, the European space law, doesn't it constrain the development of European space? I think the European Act was promulgated, and Hugo, you could answer. Yes, I picked the topic up earlier, so I will answer that question. What we call the European Space Act is a draft regulation that's in Brussels right now. On paper, and if we make a comparison to what's been done in the digital space, it's a good idea to try and have a common framework and, for example, harmonize the laws in France on this topic with that of other states in Europe. And above all, make sure that space operators that want to have access to the European market are submitted to the exact same rules as in the digital space. So there is a regulatory power of the EU that can be exerted. What we see in that text that's a bit more worrying, however, is that there are quite a few exemptions that have been planned and a few backdoors, if you must, that we will need to talk about to make sure that European regulators are not getting too tight or not over-regulating before we get started. Otherwise, that act will be more of an anti-European act, which will mean less competitivity for European actors compared to our international competitors and US competitors mostly. So that will be talked about in the next few weeks and months. Yes, it's starting up right now, so it's something we'll be following closely.
Perhaps there's something that you would like to add. Yes, I see that there is some interest for regulation issues. First of all, let me tell you that we are not naive about regulation. We have discussions with the French foreign ministry and with diplomats. We are aware of that legal dimension, and we know that our competitors want to force us doing things that we don't want to do, and that would question the roadmap that Fabrice mentioned earlier on, including our actions in space. Secondly, we can only realize that we will remain reliable in the way we operate in space, but we've got to be pragmatic, taking into account the context, identifying the small steps that can be taken, and the quick wins that we can build on. It's complicated, but we try to identify those, and to begin with, we must be able to establish a dialogue on the basis of trust with other EU state members. Thirdly, as you said, Hugo, the space law is something we have to better contextualize. We have entered a logic of blocks. As Europeans, we need to be fully respected on the international scenes, and we must weigh on international discussions on laws and standards. And we will be stronger if we go there together. We already have a law on space operations. it goes without saying that that Space Act should not be more restrictive than the law on space. There's an exemption on military activities. What's at stake here is to make sure that the perimeter is as tight and well-defined as possible, as well as having a clear notion on graduality. The initial objective could end up to be counterproductive. We have to remain aware of this, but we have a logic of common market, and we must weigh together and gain in competitivity. Thank you very much, Guilhem, and thank you all for this fascinating roundtable. Thank you. Thank you.